Hey there, all things chess with CyberTao. I am CyberTao. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue our series of isolated pawns. We're looking at strictly piece maneuvers now. We've already gone over both d4, d5, and f4, f5, the only real pawn breaks in the position. We're looking at strictly piece maneuvers to attack the kingside now. We've seen the typical strategies of moves like knight e5 in creating a queen and bishop battery with bishop c2 and queen d3. We're going to move on to the topic of rook lifts. You see it some in these sorts of positions. It's not as frequent as moves like knight e5 and queen d3 and bishop c2, but rook lifts are definitely an important concept in these sorts of positions, and we'll see what exactly I mean by rook lift once we get into the position. But the example game I chose for this was Vladimir Tukmakov against Viktor Korchnoi. This was a game from 1970 USSR Championship. Start with d4, knight f6, c4, e6. Korchnoi was more known for playing the Grunfeld, but just like any world-class player, he could play any opening at any time. Knight c3, bishop b4, standard Nimzo Indian play. e3, castle. This is the most solid response to the Rubinstein. I've said this in a couple other videos before, but if you're looking for a more interesting way to play it against the Rubinstein, I would say b6 offers the most winning chances. So if you're in a must-win position as black, I would give b6 a try. But castles is, of course, the standard move. Bishop d3, c5, knight f3, d5. And this is the tabia of all tabias for the Nimzo Indian. This is where virtually all the main lines sort of branch off. And because this position is in such flux, you've got two different sets of pawns attacking one another. There's a huge amount of change that's possible in the center. So a lot of these lines can transform in and out of one another without any warning whatsoever. So the variations can often meld together and really create a lot of move order issues for both sides. There's many different moves here. My two repertoire choices, I'll just highlight those. Fortunately, I played dx-c4, which is one of the standard moves. Knight c6, interesting move. Basically, this move sort of keeps the tension in the entire position and tries to force white to make all the choices. One of my standard repertoire choices, a3 is a standard move here. And then instead of taking on c3, which is the standard theoretical choice here, I sort of like bishop a5. This is called the Reykjavik from when Fischer played this against Spassky in 1972. It's still a fairly low theory choice. Basically, it's got one main line, and I can show that real quick. CD. Just the main points. If white takes, just B, and white's pawns are completely spoiled. This is a fantastic position for white. That's the main positional point of bishop a5. But CD, take. And then bishop g4. And there's a sort of a quasi-main line after this. Basically, black's going to say that he has compensation for the pawn in the form of white's spoiled pawn structure and his piece activity. And I would say that it works out to just about that. The main line leads to a fairly equal position. But it's a fairly low theory approach, which is sort of why I'm attracted to it. My other repertoire choice is actually the game choice, dx-c4. One of the major main lines from here is c takes, e takes, and this is known as the Karpov system. This, I would say, is overall black's highest quality choice, but the downside is it has a lot of theory attached to it, and it has a lot of forced draws, and that's what really turns me off of playing this as black. If you're playing in like a match for the World Championship, or you're playing in a closed round-robin tournament, a draw as black isn't a big deal. If you're playing in a weekend Swiss, and there's only 5 rounds to get all the points you can, headed for a forced draw as black can often be a problem. But it's still a high-quality system. I just like to keep as many winning chances in the position as possible, even with black. So, Korchnoi played dx-c4, bishop takes c4, knight b7. And this is my other repertoire choice when playing the Nimzo. This is often called the Parma variation. Black holds off on making any other choices for the central configuration just now. This also benefits in keeping white's dark square bishop sort of clogged up. One of the downsides of the Karpov is that the white dark square bishop is immediately allowed to develop. Bishop g5 is one of the main theoretical moves from that point, whereas here, that dark square bishop is going to have to work a lot harder to find a good post. So Tukmakov chose queen b3. That's one of the sidelines. The main theoretical line is queen e2. And then the quick main line after this, dc, queen c7. And this is sort of the main line, the main position of the Parma variation in the Nimzo. Black inflicts hanging pawns on white. That c pawn can be hopefully be shown to be a weakness if you're playing as black. In return, white gets the bishop pair. That's definitely an asset in this position. And he tends to be able to generate some kingside attacks with his pushing his hanging pawns, plus he has a little bit of a space edge. This is a pretty balanced position. If you're playing as black and you're looking for winning chances, you'd be happy to have this position. But queen b3 was played. This is a bit more of a sideline. a6, this threatens b5, so it sort of forces white's hand. White plays a4, which stops b5, but it creates a weakness in the b4 square, which black is happy to see. Queen e7, not the main move. b6 is probably best. Just like in standard isolated pawn positions, this light square bishop on c8 is the problem piece to deal with. If black can get that bishop actively employed, that's quite often the linchpin for the entire position. If black can activate that piece, he's usually doing at least okay. But queen e7, it's still fine, just not... b6 is probably a little bit better, because he does need to get that bishop to work. Rook d1. Bishop a5, this is definitely a bit too much time. There's no reason to move that bishop. Rook d8 is one of a few moves that makes a little bit more sense just to complete development. Bishop a5, queen c2. d5 is a little bit more straightforward. I'm not going to go too far into it because, as usual, I'll have the annotated PGN file that you can look at, plus I want to get to the actual isolated pawn position. But just the quick main line of what I looked at. And this still looks balanced. Basically, d5, it's a bit more aggressive, but it's just another balanced way of playing the position. But queen c2 tries to keep more tension in the position. So black goes ahead and takes on d4, so this gets us to an isolated pawn position. Honestly, it's not a good time to transition to an isolated pawn position. Really, the whole point of the Parma system is that dark square bishop on c1 is a problem piece for white, almost as much as the problem piece on c8. So the two problem pieces sort of balance one another out. As soon as black transitions the isolated pawn, that bishop on c1 suddenly has a fantastic diagonal. It can hop right to g5 and it's immediately employed in the game. So, unless black is able to demonstrate that d4 is a weakness, all that black has really managed to do is activate one of white's pieces. And in the game, in this specific position, the pawn on d4 really isn't a weakness. There's nothing immediately wrong with it. Plus, it's securely defended by the rook on d1. So not a great time to transition, in my opinion. In my opinion, rook d8 was a little bit better, just to continue development. And then maybe he can think about moves like b6, bishop b7, and just leave the onus on white to find those make those choices to transition structures. But ex d4, we get our isolated pawn. Knight b6, bishop a2. a6 was chosen. This is probably the best move, because in some lines, bishop g5 really matters, especially if white sets up that battery with bishop b1. So taking the g5 as a square away from white can be a big deal. The downside is, and we've seen that in a few of our other games, the other way of blunting out that battery is to play g6, but then that creates dark square weaknesses. The alternative with h6, once white creates that battery, there's nothing actually blocking white out from h7. So in a lot of positions, you'll either have to play g6 anyways, or permanently keep that knight on f6 to prevent mates. Another problem, as we'll see in the game, the h6 and g7 pawns can get fairly weak. Because the h6 pawn, if there were a way of pinning the g7 pawn, that's called foreshadowing, if there were a way of pinning that pawn, you could take an h6 without consequence. So it's sort of a trade-off. Here, I think h6 is fine as long as black follows it up correctly. But as happens in the game, h6 becomes a definite weakness. So knight e5. As usual, this is the square the knight belongs on in an isolated pawn structure. Just 98% of the time does, like 98.2%. It's the best square for the knight, especially since this knight is on b6. Just a reminder, the knight on b6 helps control d5 more, so the d5 break isn't an option, but it doesn't fight for the e5 square, so the e5 square becomes more or less a permanent outpost square for whites. Bishop d7. This is an outright mistake here. This is way too passive. Knight db5 is necessary, not only to get another piece drifting towards the king side, but to prevent one of white's possible moves, which we'll see here in a bit. It carries the concrete threat of knight b4, eliminating that very scary light square bishop. As always in these positions, it's not enough for black's position to look nice. Black has to start generating threats and counterplay of his own. If he never generates counterplay and never generates threats, white will just build up at leisure and crush his kingside. So knight bd5 at least creates the threat of knight b4 that white has to respond to. So one possible line, bishop e1, queen e2, and I think white's slightly better, but black has managed to slow down white's build-up. White's not able to just build at leisure here. Black's creating things of his own. But bishop d7 doesn't create any threats at all. Bishop e1, not the best move, so this will be the first part where we see what I mean by rook lift. So instead of bishop e1, rook d3 is the best move here. So why is this called a rook lift? Well, as always, rooks want open files. They don't want to be stuck behind pawns. So here on d1, the rook isn't active. It's smacking up against the d pawn. It doesn't have any scope. Whereas after rook d3, the plan is to move this rook to either g3 or h3, and suddenly it's shooting down unopposed at black's kingside. That's why it's called a lift. It's lifting up and over white's pawns in the kingside. So instead of having to advance these kingside pawns to activate the rook is just lifting over those to shoot directly at black's kingside. This is a very strong move here. Being able to add this rook's activities to the kingside attack is a humongous contribution. Just one line that I looked at. So if black accepts the challenge and takes the loose pawn on a4, queen e2, white has sacrificed a pawn, but he has overwhelming play for it. First off, he's got the bishop pair. Both these bishops are very well placed. The bishop on a2 is, of course, on a useful diagonal. The bishop on c1, because black chose h6, the bishop on c1 is already developed without having moved, because in a lot of these positions, bishop takes h6 is going to be a huge threat, now that the rook is lifted over to help on the third rank. So white has a humongous initiative here. One potential line, I'll just quickly go over it. Knight bd7, rook g3, bishop e1, redirecting the bishop back to attack the king side. Rook h3 is the move I would choose. You could also play bishop a3 and just win material. But rook h3 is more incisive. It just goes straight for the kingside attack. This is overwhelming for white. Most of black's pieces aren't properly placed for defense. The only piece that isn't involved with the kingside attack is white's rook on a1. Whereas most of black's pieces can't even get over to the kingside, much less are anywhere near it to help. So bishop e1, white's choice, it's not the best. Rook fd8, so neither side is really looking at that rook lift as a possibility, apparently. Again, black needed to play knight bd5 to create some threats and slow white down. At least then, that prevents rook d3 because of knight b4. At least that slows white down a little bit. But on rook fd8, we finally get the rook lift, rook d3. And this is even stronger than the previous variation. White is just absolutely ready to play rook g3 and either slam a sacrifice on h6 or g7. This is a crushing position for white. Rook ac8, bishop e8 is a sad necessity. It's actually a common resource in these sort of isolated pawn positions, when you develop the bishop to d7 at least. Ideally, you'd like to play b6 and have it shooting down the long diagonal on b7. But in positions where you've had to develop your bishop to d7, it's often a good idea to drop it back to e8. The main reason, it helps shore up the black king side, and we'll see here in a variation here in a bit how it helps do that. But it's just as active on e8 as it would have been on d7. It's shooting at that a4 pawn, it's cleared off the D file, so it's not blocking up black's rook activity. And it's helping shore up that f7 point. One concrete variation. First off, white should just play rook g3. White is most certainly still better here. He has a humongous attack. But one example of how the bishop on e8 can be useful, bishop takes h6. This is a completely thematic sacrifice for these sorts of positions when you've committed to a rook lift. Queen d2. And suddenly f5. And the bishop on e8 is really displaying its use. It's protecting the knight on h5, and the knight on h5 is the only thing preventing rook g3, which would be decisive. So this is still a balanced position, but cute variation showing how the seemingly passive piece in e8 can suddenly be useful. So bishop e8 was absolutely necessary, but rook ac8 is just far too passive. Or not necessarily passive, it just ignores the threats on the king side when these are already decisive. So rook g3 just lined up directly against the black king. Whenever you can get this sort of rook lift in, and black's not crashing through on the queen side, it's most likely going to be decisive, because having that sort of material lined up against the black king directly is incredibly powerful. Rook g3, king f8, that's a mistake. Bishop e8, it gives up a pawn to try to construct a defense. So bishop takes h6 and then g6, and then the bishop is helping guard that f7 g6 construction. This is winning for white. He's up a pawn. He still has a kingside attack going. But at least this slows white down long enough that potentially black could maybe get counterplay on the queen side. But king f8 doesn't even accomplish that. White plays queen d2. There's no need to prepare a sacrifice. Bishop takes h6 immediately is decisive. And as I mentioned earlier, whenever black plays h6 in these isolated pawn positions, this is one of the concrete drawbacks, that if on a rook lift, a sacrifice like this is going to be decisive, because it takes advantage of that weakness that black created in his kingside pawn shield. So one variation, queen c1, just threatening taking. King e8, the king runs away. Bishop 6 clears out, but then rook g7. And this is completely decisive. In terms of material, white already has 2 pawns for the sacrifice piece. But white has 2 major threats. He has rook x f7 and then bishop g6. Both those are completely decisive. This position is completely winning for white. But queen d2, not incisive enough. Knight bd5, not feeling the urgency of the threats. Knight g8 was passive but completely necessary. He has to shore up that h6 point to prevent the sacrifice that's coming. One example line, queen c2 you play. If black played knight f6, that would give white a second bite of the apple. I'm playing bishop takes h6, but let's say bishop c6, queen h7, penetrating the king side. And just one quick example line. White's absolutely winning here, but this is still complex. White needs to find the winning moves here. Whereas in the game, knight bd5, Tukmakov played bishop g6. It's cute, but it's not the most incisive move. Rook takes g7 is the correct move here. And again, whenever you play these rook lift variations, where you lift your rook to g3 or h3, looking at those sacrifices, the bishop x h6, the rook x g7, that needs to be at the top of your list, because they're going to be very thematic for these sorts of positions. And here, rook x g7 completely shatters black's king side. King x g7, queen x h6, and then bishop g5. And this is a fun position because basically black is just completely paralyzed. White's down a full rook, but it doesn't matter because the side of the board that matters right now is the king side, and white has a localized superiority of material on the king side. One example line, bishop takes, rook c3. h3 is a very cute move. Basically, white's just taking time out to make a little bit of lift for his king, so he doesn't have to worry about mate. And he's got threats like bishop. He has threats like knight g4. He has threats like bishop h7 check. This is all decisive. White's completely winning. Just one example line: rook dc8. If black plays that, knight g4. That's one of the major threats, and black's collapsing. But on rook dc8, then the bishop on d7 is loose, and this is completely decisive for white. He's up in material. and he has an ongoing attack. So Rook xg7, this is an important move for these lines. This is completely thematic. When you play these rook lifts, you need to be calculating these variations constantly, because these are going to be the heart and soul of these positions. Once you've committed to that rook lift, if you don't break through on the king side, you basically just wasted time, and that can be time your opponent's taking advantage of on the queen side. So whenever you make that rook lift, it's imperative to be making these calculations to check these sacrifices. Luckily for white in this position, black really hasn't achieved anything of counterplay on the queen side, so he can take all the time he wants, but you should still play the best moves. So bishop g6, not the best move. Bishop e8, not accurate. Bishop c7 is correct. This is still better for white, but just an example. Bishop c7 discourages a capture on f7. So on bishop x8, bishop x7, black can just take and remove the guard from the bishop. Then on knight x7, of course you just take a rook on g3. But white isn't forced to take an f7, you just drop back to d3. And cute sacrifice here, again, completely thematic for this position. Rook xg7. Again, when you play these rook lift variations, check that move over and over. If you play rook g3, check rook xg7, check bishop xh6. They're the heart and soul of these positions. Black has to decline, and I give one of those lines. I won't go over that, but on this, queen xh6, and queen h8 mate is threatened, and black doesn't have good response at all. Black is up a full rook, but it doesn't matter, because his rooks are on c8 and d8, which have nothing to do with the actual theater of battle. So bishop c7 was the best move. He played bishop e8, and then the pretty sacrifice, queen xh6. Black has to decline. Black plays queen b4 in the game, just to look over the pretty line that happens if he takes. Bishop takes, king g8, bishop b4, knight xd5, and this is completely winning for white. Once black takes, and bishop d3, white's up 2 pawns. The passed h pawn will just march up the board. This is completely winning. Add to that, the black king is still exposed, and there's still plenty of pieces on the board, so white still has an ongoing attack from here. So queen xh6 is completely sound. Black continues with queen b4. I'll just go over a few of the remaining moves briefly. We're far afield from the isolated queen pawn ideas, but it's still a pretty game. Takes knight d3, not the most accurate. Knight f3 is more accurate, and I give a line in the game notes that you can look at. But knight d3, bishop takes, bishop a3, check, king c7, and then bishop e7, and we'll end our review here. You can look over the rest of the moves in the game, but white's winning material, and he still has an ongoing attack. I'm not sure exactly why Korchnoi continued to resist for that long. Tukmakov might have been in time pressure. That was back when they used actual wooden clocks with clock faces, so he might have been thinking that he could have flagged Korchnoi. Which makes me think, I'm old enough, and there are people watching this video young enough, that you've probably never used a wooden clock, which makes me feel incredibly old. Anyway, so the real meat of this game thematically is much earlier. First off, h6 is a very consequential decision. And I want you to look at sort of the difference between that and the g6 that we've seen in earlier games. h6 controls the g5 square, but it also comes at a cost, because the g7 and h6 pawn often end up being weaknesses. The rook lift sort of precisely takes advantage of those weaknesses. It takes advantage of the g7 square being weak. It takes advantage of the a6 pawn potentially not actually being guarded if there's a pin on the g file. So h6 wasn't necessarily bad, but it's a very consequential decision. And of course, black starts going wrong, and that he never actually develops play for himself. White could have played the rook lift earlier, but essentially once white gets the rook lift in, He doesn't execute 100% perfect afterwards, but he's always better after that rook lift. Basically, getting that material into the game without punishment means that white is going to be much better. Basically, the punishment is if black needs to punish white immediately for putting that rook out on g3 or h3 by either developing play in the center with a pawn break or in the queen side. If black never develops that play for himself, that basically means white got an extra piece into the attack for no charge. And that's almost always going to be decisive in these positions. So, have a look at the game. It's a very interesting, got some interesting thematic attacking ideas. We're going to continue tomorrow with another video looking at rook lifts, and then I think we'll switch over to a black perspective to see how you play against the isolated pawn. But my name is Cybertel, also John, and I will see you then.